Okay, Carja. Gurmila, why give us happy man and actor and he for fluxia? I'm mindful that we have people who are travelling as far away as Ballycastle who are giving us a hard time because it says in the Irish News it started at 7. But it started at 7:30 according to Phil a football and the Glornamona, so let's go to Shin. It's more an honour to me, goals have been shown up to Virginia is Agriac Public Oigan Midway or youth and community organisation who work through the medium of Irish. Gael and Gill has been open 2.5 years now, and one of the aims of the centre here is to bring grassroots politics to our local area. So we've had a number of high city speakers, none more so than Mansfield, who we have the good honour of introducing here this evening. I'd like to give himself and Padraig a round of applause all over. It's even better they took the time to come here because they're in the middle of a very emotive court case. A lot of the families were to be here. A lot of the charity, well, who were to be here this evening, but I think the court case has been a bit heavy over the last couple of days, so I don't think they've all made it here this evening. So we're going to be very informal. The format of the evening is that Padraig, who is a solicitor, who many of you will know is also a GAA man. He cut his cloth with Laker Log League, sorry, Need and maybe in future he's going to return to his roots, but we'll see. Well, that's a conversation for another day. But Padraig has been working on the case with Michael, and he, the format that we're going to use here this evening is that Padraig is going to have an interview or an informal Q&A with himself and Michael, and then our plan is to open it up to the floor and to try and be as informal as possible. When we spoke earlier on, we were talking about the fact that there's not much to talk about, but we could do 5 events or we could do 3 nights in a row, so we're not going to be able to cover all the work that Michael has been involved in. The was our shock you helped and he has far a horse Steve. So because I'm here will you build us all over the Padraig and Murray.
Okay, Falcha Road for me on Saturday living up the Macara Michael Mansfield QC. Very happy to be with you and for Michael to be here with us. And I'm just going to ask some questions, but I'm obviously keener that we open it up to you later on for some questions. But very recognisable lawyer, probably one of the most accomplished lawyers of his generation, of his time. A radical, he likes radical human rights lawyer. You'll all be familiar with some of the cases that he'll be involved in. So we're going to talk about some of those tonight, but we also want to talk about some of the lesser known cases in his early career as well. So some of the stories are very, very interesting. We had a conversation in the last hour over a bottle of wine, so bear with us. So we nearly ordered a second bottle of wine, we third of made us come up here in time. It's always a good crowd. So, I mean, obviously, Michael, you've been involved in the law for over 50 years, and that made me saying, and you still have a deep anger about injustices, and I want to get to know.
Sorry, it's the special branch.
The 30s in West Belfast, so the alarms have been up.
Michael's the only one who's supposed to have a phone on. Can I go down on the sailing?
No, well, I had it. Sorry, I'm going to take this over. You think I'm going to answer questions? You've got to be joking. No, what? It's in the book, if you've read it. No, it just reminded me. You think this is a setup, don't you? In the early days of mobile phones, how many here are as old as me? Probably no one, really. But they were the size of house bricks. Yeah? They weren't like this. And so, you know, that's what this sounds. And I'm just doing an ordinary trial in South London in a Crown Court, then called something else. And I'm cross-examining a witness who's, you know, a heavy dude, huh? And he's got round here, a big jacket, bigger than this, almost hand-sewn sequins on every side. And it's coming up to 5 to 1. And he's got what I hadn't got, and obviously the judge certainly didn't have, which is a mobile phone. This is in the early whenever, you know, 1990s. And he sort of lifts it out. And he says, and of course the judge didn't quite know what he's doing. And you know when you get lockjaw, don't you? You don't quite, what, is this really happening? And he says, hello, Mum. Yeah, well, you never guess where I am. Oh, I'm being cross-examined by that, you know, what's his name? Oh, God, I can't remember. Anyway, he hasn't asked any of the right questions. What's the problem then? Oh, what? No, I'm not coming home for lunch. Not yet, no. 5 to 1. No, give me another few minutes. The judge says, I'm wearing pince-nez, you know, in the old, right on the edge of his... Excuse me, young man, exactly what is it you have in your hand? So he says, well, you just speak into it, and you can speak to my mother right now. He said, I have no wish to speak to your mother, let alone my own mother, and I think you're going to reside in a cell down below for at least an hour, while I'll have your phone, if you don't mind, and I'll see whether you can have it back at 2 o'clock. And there was this sort of amazing, you couldn't make it up. You couldn't write it. It actually happened there in front of everybody. And there was sort of semi-laughter, semi-not laughter about the fact that, you know, it had intruded into a courtroom. In a way now, of course, you have in Ballymurphy, we've all got our phones, and occasionally you do leave them on by mistake, you know, and they go off, and some of them have got... One person I had in court, sorry, I'll finish in a minute.
I'll go and sit down here for a minute.
I'll finish in a minute. No, I just remembered somebody... You can get a telephone ringtone, which is a machine gun fire. And it went on... And it was ducking for mad, so I haven't got one of those. But the problems of modern technology, which I know they're going on, isn't it the anniversary of the web? I think it is, today or tomorrow. Anyway, what are we here for?
Am I back in again?
Yeah. Sorry.
Speaking of mothers, I want to talk about your mother. But
oh my God.
Marjorie. And I want to talk about your father, Frank. So I want to talk a bit about your background and how Michael Mansfield became Michael Mansfield QC. So your father, people in this room probably be surprised to know, your father was a soldier, fought in the First World War, lost a leg. Your two brothers were soldiers. You were almost going to Sandhurst before the legal career intervened, possibly.
I got admitted.
Your mother was very pro-establishment, and she irritated her youngest son by making him canvass for the local MP, who was, you'll all know, Margaret Thatcher. So, yeah, that's the truth.
At least there's 2 of us in here.
So, you had a background which obviously you come on, now
I've kept very quiet until now.
But I wanted to talk a wee bit about your early life, and I suppose in particular about your mother, who seems to be, reading your book, a big influence on your life. But probably a very formative moment for you was when your mother got involved in a legal case relating to a parking fine, which she fought. She was very pro-establishment. She fought the case. I think your father was the star witness, and she was acquitted. But it changed her view of men in uniform, and she told you never to trust men in uniform. So I'm wondering if that was a formative moment for you, and you often thought of those words when you were tackling police corruption in the case you were doing in England, and you're obviously dealing with men in uniform in this case now. But tell us a wee bit about your background and the influence of your parents and the different kind of background you had from many people in this room, because we could have been cross-examining you today.
You could,
instead of M45 or General
I went to a school where they had a cadet force, and I joined it and rose through the ranks, and they suggested I go to Sandhurst. So I mean, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but yeah, okay. So I became a junior under officer, the first one of its kind. This is years and years and years ago. So that was where I was set to go. My father thought that was rather grand. I wasn't sure whether it was grand or not grand. But he'd been in the army, my oldest brother was in the army, and the younger one was in the Fleet Air Arm. So I'm sort of war baby. So it's a very different background to now, and I do think about it occasionally because it was sheltered. I mean, you know, we didn't go on holidays. I didn't travel. We stayed in the same house for the whole of my, you know, growing up period, which is rare these days. Well, it seems to be. And so I really only knew a quite limited world in a way. And Thatcher was part of it because of my mother. being Tory and being very active about it, and I used to have to deliver her the mail at election times, and my mother would get letters from Margaret Thatcher saying, because she was quite good at this, right, saying, "We are so pleased that you've endeavoured to help us yet again with 4,722 letters were delivered by you. And here is a commendation from the Finchley Conservative Party." And I did keep one of those thank you letters and framed it and stuck it on my wall later, which read, "Dear Mrs. Mansfield," and people come to the house and they go, "What, your wife? What?" I said, "No, it's my mother that did this." But she had a very independent streak, and she got into a bit of bother. And the bother, needless to say, in the leafy zones of North Finchley was parking. And because my father was disabled through the First World War, she used to park near to a branch of Sainsbury's, not the supermarket, the old butcher kind of thing, you know, small shop. And she always went to the same place, she always parked at the same place, no yellow lights, nothing like that. Goes in, whatever she has to buy, she comes out, and she gets a summons, no tickets in those days, for parking between the studs of a pedestrian crossing. Now, she knew she hadn't. She was convinced, and she knew she was right. It's like a lot of people I've had to represent, including the ones I'm representing at the moment. She knew she was right, and she wasn't going to put up with this. Most people say, "Oh, you know, I don't know what my father called her, I can't remember, Marge or something. You know, just relax, forget it. You know, what's it going to be, £5 fine?" She said, "No, I didn't. You were there." And he said, yeah, I was there. Well, I'm told this story afterwards, but... so she fights it, and she goes to Highgate Magistrates Court. I remember all this because it was reported in the end, because it's so unusual. She fought it, and she did, you know, this is again telling my age, Perry Mason. Anyone remember Perry Mason? Oh, good. I feel at home here. At last, people who remember things I do. Okay, Perry Mason, you know, wheelchair and all that. She defended herself. Excellent idea. You know, she realised in those days, forget lawyers, just do it yourself. She did it herself, she defended herself, and come the critical moment, she obviously said, "I didn't bark, novel though, I've got a note now," and she called my father as a witness. And the police officer had overlooked the fact there was somebody in the car, and so it just sort of made up the fact the car was between the studs and forgot there was someone in it. So my father came in, not in a wheelchair, but he only had one leg. And I can imagine, because he was quite like this, he'd probably do away with the false leg and hop into court. You know, and of course the jury are going, "Oh my God," oh, not the jury, the magistrates and a panel or whatever they had in those days. And they're going, looking at my father. And of course my father said, "Well, yeah, I'm sitting there, and she always parks in the same place. We wouldn't dream of breaking the law," you know. And so she won hands down. It's got headlines, you know, in the Finchley Times, I think. And she said thereafter, she said, "If they'll do that to me, and it's just a parking, can you imagine what they're doing to the rest of the world?" She said, "Don't you, you know," I was always sitting in the back, rather, well, I wasn't an only child because the others had gone, but sitting in the back of this car, as she ranted on every time she saw what she called them blue bottles. Every time she saw one, she said, "Watch what he's doing, because whatever he's doing, it's not what he says he's doing." So I was you know, totally impregnated mentally with this picture of the fact that you have to take it on, don't accept anything. And I was influenced, because those are the things that mould your life, not, you know, not university and not degrees, but experiences of everyday life, and you realise that you can make a difference. That's what she actually, I think, communicated to me. You can make a difference. You don't have to put up with it.
And you eventually move into a career in law. And your first case was as a prosecutor, as a pupil.
Yeah, I went
but
to...
you had more of an interest in defence, I suppose. But.
No, I mean, I knew nothing. I'm like the Spanish waiter, I knew nothing. I knew nothing. I didn't have the contacts. My father was on British Railways, as it then was. if I hadn't gone to Sandhurst, he'd hoped I was going to follow him. But so I had a railway possible career as well. In the days when careers were careers, and I think that because I got to a stage whereby it was kind of necessary to work out where you're going to go. My mother had really set the scene for me, and there was no really turning back. So going into the law, where I knew nobody, meant that she would say, "Yeah, I didn't really mean you'd have to be a law. We don't know anybody. We haven't got any resources." I mean, yeah, I'm not. Sounds like John Cleese in the Shoebox. Do you remember that one? Yeah, you do. Oh, good. There's another one. That sketch, when I was a boy, we lived in. No, well, I was a boy. I lived in. Okay. Well, I mean, yeah, we were two down in Finchley, and it was modest, very modest. It's fine, no problem. And so she said, are you not, stretching beyond your station in life? It's the sort of thing you wouldn't expect people to say, but they do. I mean, she was trying to be helpful and protective. She said, it's beyond you. What are you doing? You are entering an arena you know nothing about. Anyway, my father unfortunately died at the very moment when I was discussing it with him. And so I couldn't discuss it any further. My mother was distraught, so I thought, well, I better get on and make some decisions here. And on top of my mother's example, there was one other thing that said to me, yeah, got to do it really. Got to do this. Got to do the law somehow or another. And that was, here's another test of your memories. I'm loving it here because actually it's like going down memory lane. Because you're going to know, do you remember, well, it became, there was an English series that became the same, The Defenders. Oh, no, nobody does remember this one. Oh well. Anyway, there's an American version.
Left here.
Okay, be quiet. There was an American series, we didn't have television, but a friend of mine had television. So, we'd go around and watch somebody else's television, and then my father in the end decided he could afford a television. One of those ones, with double doors and a cabinet and all that, mahogany, and steam coming out the back. And I watched this series, American series, and it was a father and son combination. And what completely fascinated me was that they examined cases which they didn't necessarily win, but they provided a voice, and they always took on social issues, and they were investigating them and presenting them. And I thought, this is fantastic. This is doing something that means something to someone else. And actually, it's got an end product to it. It's not something that goes on forever and ever and ever. There's the case, you investigate it, you take it to court, and you either win or you lose, or sometimes it's in between, but mostly, it's either win or lose. And also, I like the fact that more often than not, he lost, but the people he represented came away feeling, a sense of gratitude that they had been represented. And what they wanted said was said. And so that was the second thing that caused me, I've got to do this if I can. That's something I think I might be able to do. And so on top of that, so there was that, my mother, that series, and then a teacher at school, remember his name. Somebody today sent me, I showed Paddy before we came in, sent me a photograph, my early school days when I was 7 or 8. And it sort of brought things back a bit. But there was a teacher at the second school I went to who, Tintin, where he got bald head and just a twirl. Mr. Fox, his name was. Well, he claimed that he'd had his hair blown off during the war, but not in the way that you expect. He was sitting. Do you know this? He was sitting in the bath, and the geyser blew up apparently, and blew all his hair off. Anyway, he was a brilliant teacher. Absolutely, he'd love What's Going On Tonight, because he used to. I'm sorry, I'm really digressing, but this is part of the history of where I've come from. And we'd go. His lessons were completely different. There were no books, no writing. Can you imagine? None of that. And he'd go in, and he'd say, "Right, who are you?" And you say, "I'm Michael Manson." "Oh, you're Michael Manson." "I never heard of you." Anyway, "I've got a question." And he'd say something like this. He'd say, "Passports." And, you know, sometimes I say, Domino's? No, he said, stop it. You've got to follow through. Passport, what does it mean? And you gradually got what he was on about. And you say, well, you have to show them. Why do we have to have passports, boundaries, frontiers? And actually what he was on about was what we're on about now. Having a situation in which we don't have to have a backstop. You know, and he got us talking by just issuing words out like this. He in the end, he got suspended because parents said he was too radical. But it got me, anyway, amongst a number of others, I'm sure, thinking about the things into which we were about to be launched, because this is 5th and 6th form level. So that little package of influences, in the end, I thought, yeah, and he was the one. He'd have, you know, the Dead Poets Society, that film, brilliant film, and Robin Williams, where he would take them to the ones he was trying to teach, to special clubs and so on, to get them talking. Well, Mr. Fox had a little tea club which he invited people to. And he said one day to me, he said, you are going to be able to speak well one day. I don't know what he was talking about, I had no idea. But it lodged in there that he thought I had something I could do, which I hadn't spotted, he'd spotted. And he spotted it long before I was able to do it. That's the interesting thing. So these three factors brought me into a place where I could start the process, because it's a very long process, of becoming a lawyer. So those are some of the influences. They're the main influences that got me there.
He was quite right, you can speak all right. So, so you mentioned Brexit, or touched on it a wee bit, but we're going to come back to that a wee bit later. I wanted to ask you about probably your first big case, or certainly one of your first big cases, was the case of the Angry Brigade, is what they were called, who were campaigning against the restriction on trade union rights in a bill going through Parliament. Yep. They were charged with attacks on Tory politicians, and I think the Attorney General around 1971. So you were involved in that case, and obviously you're now getting involved, probably accidentally, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, and involved in social justice type cases at a very early stage, 3 or 4 years after you'd gone into the law. So tell us a wee bit about your first big case, as I know you were with a brief conversation earlier on.
I think, you know, people think somehow or another I've forged this future and it was all set in train years ago. It wasn't. It's like Topsy, it's just grown, it's accidental. I mean, I haven't planned anything. So people find that a bit strange. So I get into the law, I go through all the formalities, eventually do it. I haven't got a clue what I'm going to do. I really don't know. I'm knocking on doors. Well, you can still do it a bit, but in those days, you know, I felt the only way to, as it were, find out what you want is you knock on a door and you ask. You say, excuse me, people say, they go, you know, right, because I haven't filled in forms and all the rest of it. I haven't used the usual route. So having got to the doors effectively of pupillage, which you have to start with, and all the rest of it, what kind of practice? I had no idea. So I wasn't born with civil liberties written all over here, all over the forehead. I wasn't imbued with all that. I knew there was a sense of justice, yes, that's through my mother, but quite where that would erupt, you know, which field would it be, I didn't know. So, in fact, I have no idea how I got into it in the first place, but I wanted to do something practical. So I started work, voluntary work, in a drop-in centre in London. Just trying to remember the name of the organisation, it'll come to me in a minute, who organised this. This is in a period of time, again, you may remember in the sort of 60s, when drugs were in frontline news all the time. They are still, but in a different sense then. It was a novelty, and there were a lot of accidents, and worse than that, people who were getting themselves into habituation. And so I did the drop-in centre and started helping people to, as it were, kick the habit. Mainly at the top end with heroin addiction, as it then was, and the government only just beginning to realise that legalisation and registration was the way through, which is what they did do. but meanwhile there were people dropping in dead in the street. So it was fairly frontline work, and I did it maybe once or twice a week in the evening, and in the daytime trying to find some other work. But I met a solicitor, and who unfortunately is now dead, but he became very well known. Bernard, I just remember him as Bernard, and we became friends and we did this work. And he said, well look, would you like to do these cases in court? So I said, yeah. I would like to do these cases in court and try and help the system understand the problem. So we worked a lot together, and then one day, that's how it happened, he just said, look, I've got a very different case for you, if you're interested, because I'm not sure everybody will want to do this. So he said, you know, it's representing a member of the Anger Brigade. And I said, I've never heard of them. You know, what are they about? I did philosophy as a degree, so I sort of looked them up, and I looked up what they stood for, and I looked up the fact that they were an international, linked to an international movement. I said, yeah, this sounds interesting. And they put incendiary devices in doorways of banks and politicians, and they were protesting about the Industrial Relations Bill, which I knew a bit about, but I know they're trying to get in everywhere. And so I just thought, I've got to, as it were, catch up and find out what all this is about. And I did the case. It was one of the longest ever in legal history at that point, 9 months, in 1971, I think. And my mother was horrified that I was representing anybody known as the Anger Brigade. And she thought it was travesty, treacherous, what would Margaret say, and so on. So you could begin to see the tension, but she knew also that, you know, I was, as she was, a bit stubborn and also a bit of a rebel. So I did that case, and it's like, I suppose, ending up in some TV drama or something. You get typecast. Once you're there, and it's fairly high profile, and somebody says, well, we'll have him. You know, even if you haven't done brilliantly. Although she did, the person I can't mention her name because she became rather well known. And I don't want to keep raising it in public. But she got acquitted, as did a number of others. The jury were very good in that case. 4 were acquitted, 4 were convicted, and of the 4 convicted, the jury actually said, which was very unusual, to the judge, would you know, we think they're honest individuals who meant honestly to change government policy. They understood the iniquity of injustice. Please, you know, please be kind to them. And he was. It was really quite a remarkable case from that point of view. I wasn't involved with the ones who got convicted. I was later, but that's another story. So that case put me on the political agenda for others who came along afterwards, of which the Price sisters were the next ones, because they also went to the same solicitor. So it wasn't me, it was Bernard. They all knew him, he knew me, we trusted each other. He said, would you like to do this one? No one wants to do this one. I said, what is this one then? He said, well they've, you know, bombs in London. I said, oh, yeah, my car. They blew up my car. I said, how can I represent when they blew up my car? And in here you can get 2 of these for the price of 1 now. There's a photograph of the blown up car. And it was, you know, it's my first car ever that I saved up for. You know, and I was sitting in the Old Bailey, and, you know, there was hardly any warning. There was suddenly a fire bell went off. It's lunchtime, and I was sitting in the library upstairs next to, he's got it there. Yeah, it's there. And I was sitting in the library, and suddenly there was a huge, I mean, you know, I remember to this day, I couldn't, well, you're probably very familiar with the impact of this. The window frame, it's like those early films, black and white films that Buster Keaton, you know. The whole frame just came straight down over me, and I'm sitting at this desk with a window frame around me. I can't believe it. I look out of the empty hole, I see my car. It's complete, you know, blown out of the water. And we're all told to stay where we are, so I stay where I am, you know, in a completely shattered situation. Of course, you know, unknown since the Second World War, and I had a remembered bombing of a kind then. But this was something quite different. And eventually I went down to get the car, and they said, is it, you know, the police, I had to sign a statement saying my car and when did I park it and all that stuff. And I got a friend to tow it back to my home address in North London. And I put it outside the house and went to bed pretty exhausted, and then about 3 in the morning there was a banging on the door downstairs. I'm not accustomed to wearing pyjamas or anything, so I just rushed down to the front door and I opened it. There's 2 coppers standing out there, and I go, "It's you, Mr. Mansfield?" I said, "I hope so. Yeah, why? What's the problem?" He said, "Well, we've got very bad news for you." I said, I don't want any more, thank you." He said, "Well, we've been patrolling up and down here. Your car has been vandalised." I said, no, it's been blown up. Blown up? Whoa! And so this whole thing escalated, and then I went to the insurance company and said, "Come on, give me some money for this wreck of a car." And they said, no, act of God. I said, "Tell that to the IRA.
Okay, well, slightly going off, so I was going to ask, I was going to fast forward just a wee bit until 1984. Now, 1984, we'll come back to the Irish cases in a wee minute, but 1984 was a momentous year, politically across the water, but also personally for you. The miners went on strike.
Yeah.
And you became involved in a number of cases, defending miners who were charged with public order offences. And in your book, you talk a lot about the case of, is it Bernard Jackson at the Orgreave trial in 1985, and you did say that this is one of the most important trials that you're involved in. So tell us a wee bit about how you became involved with the miners. Obviously, it's consistent with the work that you've been doing before then, but how you got involved and why those cases are so important.
It does link to the Irish case. I mean, I represented the Price sisters, and I got to know them extremely well. And I find I learn from who I represent, including the families I presently represent. I'm learning all the time. It's a learning curve all the time. So with the Price sisters, it comes into Bernard Jackson as well, same point really. And that is, I said to them in a prison in Winchester, which is where they were tried, "I want to know all about this. I want to know all about you, because you've lived here and I haven't. I've lived, North London, and it's kind of different. So what happened in your life?" And I wasn't that much older than they were. And so the more they talked, the more I thought, this could have been me, living here, thinking the things they did and the civil rights movement and all the rest of it. And in a way, they introduced me to the need for civil rights and community action. Because again, I hadn't got that background. So they began to give me that background. So I learned a lot about them, and I learned a lot about what was going on here that I didn't know. I'd done history as a degree, I got interested in Irish politics as a degree, but actually, once again, you have to be on the ground, you have to hear actually what it's like on the marches and the ambushes and the horror of it all. And so I sort of lived through all that, and then moving into the next period, in a sense, of industrial strife. Now again, I'm North London, I don't know anything about coal mines, coal miners, the union, none of it. But again, it wasn't because they came to me, it's because somebody who was involved in representing miners mentioned my name and said, would you like to come and represent miners? And I thought about this, and I thought, yeah, I mean, this is a year-long or more strike. The whole nation then were in fact involved in this, because it was much more than just, it wasn't about the usual things, it was about a way of life that was being threatened. And so I thought, well, I don't know anything, and I just set up in 1984, this will mean not a great deal if you're not a lawyer, but a set of chambers which is mine. In other words, if you like, a base from which we could all work. So I thought, right, I wanted to do that and make it our own, and make it multicultural, diverse, members that are black and white in equal number, men and women in equal number, and all the rest, young and old in equal number. That was the idea, is to make it a really diverse set, starting small and growing. And there was the miners' strike at the very moment we set up. So I said, well, we've got to do something different here. We're not going to operate from down here in London. If we're going to really represent these individuals and their community, we've got to go and live where they are. So we uprooted, we kept our chambers in London, but actually we all moved up to Yorkshire. And so I lived in a pit village, and I met all these miners, and for me, you know, I suddenly see what it's like. No money, burning their furniture to survive in the winter. You take a deep breath and you think, my God, you know, I'm lucky not to have had to go through that one. And so eventually I identified strongly with them. I ended up representing Arthur Scargill. And again, we come from totally different backgrounds. And he has an ideology which I didn't have, that ideology. And I learnt to understand what it was that was motivating actually ordinary men and women who wanted to be able to actually provide a service. And that service is providing fuel. Now, of course, there's all the fossil fuel arguments, but nevertheless, that they were just decent, ordinary people being victimized, criminalized by a government who regarded them as the enemy within. And it was very serious times then, and still is to some extent. The mines have gone pretty well, they built over them supermarkets and so on. However, representing them and winning, which we did, and the first major trial, actually the whole trial collapsed. It was in front of a judge called Cole, and he played very little part in the trial. However, they were lying through their teeth, these police officers. I put it all in the book. The lies were stupendous, probably of a kind you don't have to imagine, you're probably familiar. And there came a moment in the trial, I remember going in and the prosecutor saying, I'm going to drop the case at this point, don't feel I can continue. And he had to explain in public. And the straw that broke the camel's back was a police officer driving up the M1 to Sheffield. You get to a point, and you still do, on the motorway, where you can see the coke works, Orgreave, where this all happened, from the motorway. And apparently the note said, I was sick at the sight of Orgreave. And he turned around and he went home. So the prosecutor said, that's it. Because there were so many police officers being caught out on so many things, because there were people in the community who'd taken photographs of what was going on at a time when that wasn't very common. And so we had a lot of evidence to show just how wrong it was, including BBC broadcasts which had reversed the order of events and so on. So for me, that was an experience I've never forgotten. I've kept in contact with quite a few of the miners who are still asking at this moment for an inquiry into Orgreave, and they've been denied it time and time again. By Labour and Conservative politicians, they've been denied it. They deserve it. Yes, they were paid some compensation at the end of it, but nobody's been disciplined, nobody's been prosecuted, and our whole West Yorkshire, West and South Yorkshire mainly, have been basically let off the hook.
Okay, we had the Orgreaves people speaking at the Fela 2 years ago.
Oh, well, you know all that.
So we know a wee bit about it. I want to talk to you about another very, very important case, and the case that was very influential in my decision to become a lawyer. It's the case of Stephen Lawrence, the 18-year-old stabbed to death by white racist thugs in 1993. Within minutes, it was very clear who was involved. The dogs on the street, as we say, knew who was involved. But the police didn't visit them for days, and in between times, vital forensic evidence was destroyed. A story that will be familiar with people from our communities and our experience of policing. But this wasn't a case, like many of the cases I'm involved in, wasn't just a case about police incompetence. This was very much about institutional racism within police. So tell us a wee bit about your involvement in the Stephen Lawrence case and subsequently the Macpherson inquiry. I was reading in your opening address to it in preparation for this, but you also say this is probably the most important case you've been involved in your long, long career.
I think it's always invidious to say, you know, one case is more important than another. I think they all make a contribution which is significant and probably equal at the end of the day. And again, it's another one, you know, I didn't go asking for it, and I wasn't particularly well known amongst the black community and black politics, just a little bit. I'd done 1 or 2 cases, one of which relates to what I'm doing at the moment, but a little bit known, but it wasn't particularly my scene. But again, it was a solicitor, another one, different one. Well, he's become well known, Imran Khan, because he's associated with that case. But we'd done work together, and he was just starting out, and he worked in a firm where Bernard had worked, and so he knew me through that link, and he said, look, there's this murder case, but it's a bit unusual because it's not that you're going to be asked to defend anybody, you're being asked to assist in advising the parents of the boy who was killed. And of course that was very unusual then. It's a little more usual now as a result of the inquiry. So I said, sure, sure. And it was at a stage where you thought, well, what's so different? Because in the initial stages, it isn't so different. It's only when you start peeling it off, you suddenly realise, wait a minute, there's something dreadfully wrong here. And the more I got to hear about it through the parents, the more I realised that there had been the sort of cover-up that I've met in other arenas, but hadn't met it in this arena. And so I stuck with them, advising them about how to ask questions of the authorities who were constantly saying, it's all right, we're looking after it, don't worry, we'll get to the truth. But of course they never did. But they persisted. And their lesson that comes out of the Lawrence is a bit like, I suppose, my mother and the other things. They're just saying, you can make a difference, don't give up, just keep going. They don't expect you to keep going. They expect you'll roll over and that you'll just say, okay, okay. But she and Neville, although it's taken a tremendous toll on their domestic lives, and I won't go into all of that, but it's probably very obvious. However, Doreen, particularly because she's still living in England, Neville's gone back to the West Indies, where Stephen is buried, just realised that there was an injustice and she was not going to give up till she got the truth of how she believed things had worked out. She was completely right on all fronts. So was he. He supported all this. And so it was at a turning point again, because it was a Labour government that was coming in, Jack Straw, and if you like, the pressure, the public pressure, after there'd been an inquest in which another jury, like the Angry Brigade, the jury representing the community, had said, which they weren't supposed to say, basically the 5 are guilty of murder. That led to the Daily Mail having a headline, hesitate to use the Mail as an example of anything worth looking at, but they did. And that, to be honest, put extra pressure that there were people walking the streets who should have been prosecuted. That led to a public inquiry, led to Macpherson, who did an absolutely brilliant job from a situation in which we thought he would never do this. And I think he would say, if he was sitting here now, his eyes were opened. A High Court judge who suddenly realised what was been going on for years under his own feet. And so he became much more critical, although he was sitting with the panel. And of course they came out with a report, 77 recommendations. But that was not the end, and is not the end, because Doreen and Neville said, okay, so we got all this, now what are you going to do about it? And so every other year they held a public meeting in London, in Central Hall, Westminster. And they summoned everybody, and of course everybody came because they had a moral power, and they had an electoral power as well. So the head of police, head of politics, if you like, the Home Office and so on, they all came and she would say, so what you done? How many of the 77 recommendations have you done? She stopped doing it last year, was going to be the last year, I think exhausted. She's in the House of Lords, so she's got a platform. But they've now, May announced there was going to be anniversary day named after Stephen Lawrence. So she's come an awful long way from an ordinary background like the rest of us, really. Well, certainly like me anyway. And I just thought, there you are, another example. They've made a huge difference to police. To begin with, she, me, Imran Lawrence, Imran Khan, all regarded as renegades, traitors, undermining the morale of the British police. How dare we? Slowly, police forces began to change. Not so much that it's been eradicated, racism within the police. Institutional racism, which was the conclusion of Macpherson, was an astonishing result, and it has made a difference. And, you know, I found after that I was invited to all kinds of police colleges to address them on how this should be implemented. And slowly, but slowly, but slowly, it has been implemented, and there are differences which we all take for granted now.
Okay, I want to go back to some of the Irish cases. You obviously have a long history representing Irish clients across the water, but also in Irish soil. You were involved in the Bloody Sunday, the Savile inquiry,
yeah,
and represented, amongst others, the family of Barney McGuigan, who was shot in the back of the head going to help a man lying injured. I think he was carrying a white handkerchief. It obviously has big similarities to the cases that you're currently involved in. And in preparation for this, I was reading over some of the transcripts of that, and particularly your devastating cross-examination of Soldier F in that case of McGuigan. I don't know if you remember that, but where you got a concession out of him in terms of his involvement, or an admission out of him in terms of his involvement. Up till then he was denying any involvement in that. And again, it reminded me a wee bit in terms of what's gone just simply in the last couple of days in terms of General Howlett and Ballymorphy. You know, we can't talk a great deal about that because it's ongoing, but I did want to talk about Bloody Sunday. And your experience of that, and your experience of dealing with the paratroop regiment, and how that might have influenced your decision to come on board in the Ballymorphy case. So, if you don't mind.
Oh, I just came because of you.
I'm going to come to that story next. How you came through me.
No, I mean, I think yes, Bloody Sunday was yet another experience because, of course, although I'd had the Price Sisters, I had a affinity with, and I've been many times between the Price Sisters case and Bloody Sunday on other missions and so on, so I was very conscious of the environment here, more so than a certain Karen Bradley, I feel. And so when this came up, and again, it came through, not me going around saying, oh no, it was a solicitor in Derry who I didn't... Sorry?
Was it Des?
Yeah, Des. Yeah. And I didn't really know him, and he just said, can we go for breakfast one day? And I said, yeah, okay. I didn't know him. And he said, you know, I'm wanting to ask because you may not want to do this. And in fact, we were sitting at breakfast, and he tells me later that in fact Gordon Brown was in the same restaurant at the same time. I didn't notice who else was there. But he explained this inquiry and said it's going to take some time and it's very important. And so I said, yeah, absolutely. I see it. So I wanted again to come over, meet the families, find out what it was that had kept them going all these years. A bit like the Stephen Lawrence thing, and there's a connection because they all know each other, was to the fact that they had not lost sight, even though each of the families had a slightly different objective. And of course that's going to come into some sort of relief this week, because I think the decision is day after tomorrow. And there are some families, they all had one objective, and that was the truth. And I think the day on which Cameron stood up in the House of Commons and made the speech, and I've said many times, I'm obviously not a Tory, but you know, you give credit where it's due. It was a brilliant speech. What he did on that day was absolutely necessary, and he rose to the occasion and did it. So we watched the speech, we'd read the report. There were hundreds outside the Guildhall in Derry waiting, although families had managed to get their hands through the barbed wire or whatever was on the outside, and was sort of thumbs up to people on the outside. So people sort of knew that it was going to be a good result. Which it was a good result in the sense that Savile, he didn't go as far as he should have done, but he went quite a way. to establishing innocence and guilt at a level which mattered to the families. And in that case, you mentioned cross-examination. It's one I won't forget because, you know, you have to think hard. How are you going to ask questions of somebody? Because they know you're going to ask questions, and they know you're going to ask difficult questions. So you've got to find a different way. So you, for days and days and days before you ask them, you're wandering around the streets thinking, do I do it this way? Do I do it that way? You know, are you full frontal or are you subtle or whatever? And it's very difficult to get it absolutely right. Although on this occasion, I think I probably got it as right as I could. And I just thought, the McGuigan family are sitting, this was in the Central Hall, Westminster again, was sitting there because the hearings in relation to the soldiers took place in London. And I thought, Soldier Ref, he's going to come in and he knows the family, the widow's sitting there, the daughters, the sons, they're all sitting there. And I just thought, you know, everyone's got a conscience somewhere, locked away in some cases. It needs to be unlocked. They need to feel as a moment has come. In a strange way, that happened yesterday, but in a different lead up to it. So what I decided to do was to not sort of do some kind of verbal beat up. No, I just thought, I just ease him into a situation in which, knowing that they're there, that he can make the final step. So it was just an assembly, like a jigsaw. You assemble all the bits, until there's only one bit missing, and it's him. And he suddenly realizes there's no way out. He's going to have to say the final bit, because there's no one else who could have been responsible. And so he did admit. Now that's Perry Mason, American TV. You don't get that. And it's very rare. Well, I'd never had it. And at that moment, I'm sure Mrs. McGuigan wouldn't mind were she still here, just collapsed in the public gallery. And they had to close the whole proceedings for half an hour. Now, she was taken out on a stretcher, she was seen outside, and she just said, thank you. I don't want to be here now. I came, I got what I wanted, and now you carry on. So I thought, oh my God, right, okay. So you suddenly realise that actually, you know, once again, you can make a difference to that person's life. I'm not saying, you know, that's the end of the road. It isn't the end of the road. There are lots of other roads still being pursued. Some families want prosecutions, others don't. So, you know, there are differences there. But the ultimate objective of all the families was achieved. And it was a brilliant public inquiry. But of course, the Daily Mail and others have criticised it mainly for the fact that it cost too much and we don't want any more of these. And so Tony Blair changed the law so you don't get that kind of inquiry anymore.
Okay, that devastating cross-examination, you have it, it's in your book. I think he said 2 for the price of 1, but any young lawyers, I'd recommend reading that, and particularly reading that cross-examination. I'd also recommend coming to the Ballymurphy inquest, because when you write your next book and you talk about your examination of witnesses, you'll be talking about some of those soldiers. What I've seen in the last few days is obviously the reason that I've brought you into the Ballymurphy case. And I just want to talk a wee bit about that. We can't get into, for obvious reasons.
Perhaps it's not so obvious. Paddy can say what he wants, and he always does, and so he's fine. I'm not allowed to. As a barrister, we have different rules. I'm not saying they're sensible anymore, because if you like, the information highway and social media make it a bit of a nonsense. But I'm not allowed to make any comment about a case in which I'm currently involved. I can talk about ones I've done, provided they're over, obviously. So I'm also involved in Grenfell, but I can't talk about that either. So people find it a bit odd. The press never understand. They ring up and say, can I give an interview on... And I say, no, I'm involved in it. I can't say anything about it. So that's the reason. So I can't do anything more.
But we can't talk about how I got you into the case.
Can we? Oh, yeah.
It actually wasn't too far from here. I think I had arranged somehow, I can't even remember how I got your mobile number, but arranged a call on a Sunday afternoon. And I was playing my last competitive Gaelic football match, apart from the Laker, luckily, you got me out of retirement, against St John's, just round the corner here. You all know Corrigan Park. And I was playing in this final, the Berger Cup final. Whenever you're getting old playing football, you're not playing in senior football, you're playing in the Berger Cup. And you had scheduled a call around 3 o'clock, and the game started at 3 o'clock. So I was like, oh, fuck. So Michael Mansfield phoned, you have to take the call. And I phoned you back and said, can I wait to 6? So the game was over, rushed into the changing room, literally in my shorts, football boots off, out into the car park and gave you the call. And I don't know if you remember this.
No.
I asked you to come involved in the Ballymurphy case, and not surprisingly, you're aware of it through the Bloody Sunday inquiry with this issue. Ballymurphy was raised, but I don't know if many of you know, there was an injunction against the case being raised through Savile. It wasn't within the terms of reference. So the judge had made a decision, as I understand it, that the inquiry could not touch on Ballymurphy, although that would have been very, very important for the Savile inquiry to do that. And I'd asked you, but it did have a caveat. I don't know if you remember the caveat. And the caveat was you had to come to the Falls Road or Clonard and meet my grandmother.
I remember your grandmother.
Who was a big fan, so I'd said to Michael on the phone, do you want to get involved in Ballymurphy? And he said, oh yes, I'd be interested, know all about it, it'd be a great case. And I said, well, there's one caveat. And there was a silence. And I thought, I'll mess this up. Michael Mansfield's getting caveats, this is not going to work. But when I'd asked you, you said yes, and I think you kept your promise.
Yeah, yeah.
And we had a cup of tea and some scones at my grandmother's house. So.
But I still haven't seen you play football. But
well, that was my last competitive game, bar Furlough, once or twice a year, give me a call. But you've become involved. Obviously, the case we can't talk too much about it. But I do. Any of the audience, I know some of faces here have been down at the court. In the next 3 to 4 weeks, we do have the soldiers at the inquest, and I know there's another. The family of John Laverty are here tonight. That inquest will commence around May time. But I do recommend, particularly young people or young people in the audience who are aspiring to be lawyers, come and watch the work that the lawyers are doing in that inquest. It's been an amazing couple of weeks, couple of months for us. And I'm very, very hopeful that the inquest is going well. There's still a lot of work to be done, still a lot of preparation, still a lot of witnesses to go through, but it's going in the right direction. So I wanted just a few more short things that I wanted to talk about, and then we'll give you a bit of time. We'll take some questions from the audience. But you mentioned Karen Bradley earlier. Her comments in the last few days, given what David Cameron and those positive words that were said in the House of Commons, do you believe her comments in the last few days have undermined what he said? I'd done a radio interview just the other day on this stuff, and from my point of view, her comments were entirely consistent with the Tory government's approach to legacy. We've had the funding for inquest blocked, and some of that money's been released in the last week, but that's after a legal challenge. It's after several years of campaigning. We have seen the call for a statute of limitations for soldiers from Tory politicians as well. So for me, it's consistent. It wasn't a mistake. I think it was very clear and unambiguous, the words that she used. So, you know, in terms of what Karen Bradley said, what would you say about that?
Yes, I think it's shocking. I think it was in the Irish news today. It would pay somebody being, I mean, if you're going to be appointed Secretary of State in relation to the north of Ireland, you could at least be alerted to lost lives or something, whereby you get a background even if you know nothing. Problem is, I think Northern Ireland, well, you may have strong views about Mo Molan, but she's the last one I remember who, whether you like her or you don't like her, at least she did take an intense interest in what was going on. I think it's regarded by the politicians as a kind of backyard job, and they don't take it as seriously as they should. They're taking it seriously at the moment because of the DUP fandango. But I don't think so much that it is reflective of an attitude, but in a sense but it's an attitude that is not just in infection within the Tory party. It's very much an English infection, and it's sort of a history of the difficulties of the relationship between the United Kingdom or rather England particularly, and the north of Ireland, and also the south. That there's this estrangement, this distance. They haven't really engaged. I grew up in a situation in which we had Irish neighbours in North London, and I think but for the fact that their son joined the RAF and was killed during the Battle of Britain, I think my father would have been a bit reserved about the fact. The Irish were regarded in a way that the Jamaicans were then regarded, and so on. So it's a kind of, there's an unspoken, if you like, Brexit almost, in terms of attitude towards anyone who isn't what. And then you have to say, what is it that they're on about? So I think Karen Bradley should have resigned straight away. May obviously can't dismiss her because she hasn't got anybody else to appoint anyway. Now there are very few people who've got any competence left. And I think she should have said to herself, I'm not fit for purpose. I should go. And if she had any conscience, which she obviously hasn't, that, a grovelling apology, if that's what it is, isn't good enough, because it demonstrates quite clearly that there is no sense of history and an assumption. But it's the kind of assumption that was made in the early stages of my career about the British police always get it right. There was this assumption that would never be believed that they would be prejudiced in any way or fabricate anything. And so these traits are very inbred, and I'm not so sure that it's necessarily a policy as such, but I do think that she's done tremendous damage, and I think the headline today is she absolutely should go, and if she's not going to go, she certainly shouldn't be given any responsibility, certainly not for appointments that are coming up in which she plays a part. She doesn't deserve to do that. But of course, trying to get through to May at the moment, having now, as I gathered on the way here, lost yet another vote, and we were talking about it. I think, personally, and I know Theresa May very well. I mean, I'm not trying to name drop, but through the job, I've met her many times. She has amazing abilities, in fact. It may surprise you that I'm saying this. But having met her, she did as Home Secretary, she's one of the best Home Secretaries there have been. One, access to her. The Hillsborough family is another one that I did. Hillsborough families and Lawrence's and so on. She was always open, the door, and she listened very hard, and she gave one of the best speeches the year before all this happened to the Police Federation, where she tore them apart for Hillsborough and other things. And it was a brilliant speech. And suddenly, this is my own view, she's become seduced by that, the power that corrupts. Suddenly she's found herself in a central position, and she's hung on in a way that she should never have done. She's lost a sense of proportion, a sense of judgment, and I think today, of all days, instead of doing what she's been doing, which is, what, we're going to hang on again while she decides another vote next week? What's she actually planning? Is there something we don't know? She should actually be resigning, because she's put her policy on the line. Or there should be a general election. But I gather from the news that it's just going to go on. It's going to plough on, and we don't know what's going to happen. Now, I think that's an abrogation of responsibility, and I find there's a dichotomy in her career. Brilliant Home Secretary, probably one of the worst Prime Ministers. And it's an extraordinary thing that she stepped from one to the other. And I think it's just her being dogged about it. The men done the same thing. But I'm very caught up in this, and I find that I'm a Remainer. And I say to myself, there's been so much bullying and all the rest of it. Where's my voice in the Houses of Parliament? Who's standing up? Anybody think we didn't exist? Anybody think we weren't allowed to speak? But actually the vote was pretty close. Okay, there was a majority, but only just out of the numbers that voted. 51% for and 49 against, or something in that region. I mean, that is a divided community. It is no use. The Brexit is going on, and well, the country voted for this. And I heard, the BBC had somebody on tonight. Well, I wish they'd get on with it. Get on with what? People who've got this sort of balls aching, I call it, sort of repetition of, well, I want to see it, we voted for it, but what do they want to see? Have they really thought through? Have they really realised the repercussions? And it's such an important issue, particularly important here. And what I love about it is that actually, at the end of the day, Ireland is the most important factor in all of this, and basically should have been shown the respect it deserves. My vote would be United Ireland. Get on with it.
I'm going to finish with a couple of questions. So, you've been in the profession over 50 years. I know you don't look it, but over 50 years now.
I pay him such big money for this.
Well, legal aid do. So, what's next for Michael Mansfield? Obviously, you've mentioned Granville, which is ongoing. You're involved with myself in the Spring Hill campaign as well. There's an inquest outstanding. You're involved in the McGurk campaign. So, you're no signs of slowing down or retiring. Or so, what's next for you? Much of the same for the next 50 years?
Next 50, my God. Right. No, I think I sort of, people said a few years ago I should retire, so I said, all right, I'll slow down a bit, which I did, but I didn't retire. I'm a firm believer that actually, in positive thought, I'm not trying to be terribly spiritual, I'm just saying, I think for me, I've got to feel I want to get up in the morning because there's something out there that needs to be done that I can make a contribution to. The day I get up and I don't feel there's anything I can do more, then obviously I won't get up. But basically, at the end of the day, what else can I do? Because you're getting, broken my hip and God knows what else darting around. So I've got to be careful. I can't do the same level of stuff. I can't suddenly become a professional footballer, much as I would like to. I hesitate to say I support Birmingham City after last week, but anyway. And also, I love the drums. I play the drums, and I did it my 50th anniversary. You can watch it on YouTube, actually, if you want to. I'm free most weekends, if you want to. And you think to yourself, I was really scared about doing it, and they said, my clerk runs a group, and he said, will you come and play the drums? And I thought, God, But on the other hand, there is another life. So I go and I play the drums, and I was amazed. I watched it because my partner filmed it. I thought, that's me playing the drums. God, it doesn't sound too bad, actually. So, they got subjected to another hour of drumming. So there are other things I'd like to do, but I know full well that the only thing I can do as well as I can do is the one I'm doing at the moment. So I just want to keep doing that. So provided there's a need, I'll try and fill it. And that's how I'd like it to carry on, because it keeps you mentally fit. And when you're mentally fit, you've got to be physically as fit as you can be. I'm not as fit as I was, but I walk to court most days. It's not very far, but that'll do. So yeah, not giving up. No.
Good stuff. Last question. I know there's some young lawyers in the room. My daughter here, Maria, is a first-year university. My son's third year. But he's starting to waver a wee bit on the law. So
where is he? Stand up and be careful.
Hand up at the back.
He's just
Do this question. And I recognise a number of other lawyers and older people in the audience who might be considering a career in the law. I don't want to be ageist about it. So, what advice would you have for aspiring lawyers, or for the many lawyers in the room, in terms of their career? What advice would you give them?
Oh, the same as the one I've taken myself, and that is, I think although I didn't have a clear vision, I did have a clear passion. I knew I wanted to do that. Quite how I would do it, or where it would end up, I didn't have all that set in place. You don't have to have all that. You just have to feel inside that this is something you want to do. It's like writers, it's like painters, it's like people who, well, it doesn't have to be a creative job. It has to be something you feel you can do and that matters to you and matters to others. So it's not entirely insular, but you're giving something. You may not always have a clear idea of what it's going to be or where you're going to end up, as I say, provided you, because without that passion, you won't make it. Because there are going to be so many hurdles. There were when I started. Everybody said, you're mad. We have no money. How can you possibly do it? My parents said, you can't do it. For them, it was a class thing. They said, no, you're in the wrong class. You can't do this. We haven't got, property and all the rest of it. But you have to ignore all that. If it's something you really want to do and you feel strongly about it, you will do it. That's what happens. And I think it doesn't matter whether you're, in all these other professions, athletes and so on. That's what drives them. You have to be driven to do what you're doing. And without that drive, it's not worth it. So I think for young lawyers, don't worry about the fact that, you've got to learn a lot of stuff. I didn't learn it. God above, I don't carry it around with me. He does. I don't carry it around. It's a question of knowing where to look to find it. It's that ability. It's not about having it all here. Because underneath it all, it's moulding it into something you want to give. So you determine what it is you need, not the other way around. If you allow the job to as it were, determine you, then you fail. And because they're going to put so many obstacles in your way and say, you can't pass this, you've got to pass that, you've got to join this, you've got to do that. And actually, there's always a very heavy negative load that you have to bear. But you have to shift it off the paradigm set so that it's not there. It's there, but you accommodate it and you say, no, that's not for me. I have another, as it were, paradigm which I'm following, which is one that has an objective of moving what's in here out there.
Great answer. Okay, I'm going to open it to the floor, so if you maybe want to indicate, you raise your hand. I'll take a few questions. We've plenty of time. We've got a few questions. And there's a gentleman at the back.
There you go. Obviously, you must have had that kind of thing coming at you about Trainer. You alluded to it earlier. But you were effectively challenging the establishment on behalf of people who were seen as the enemies, the predecessors, the enemies of the establishment. On a personal level, if not professional, how did that come at you? In what ways, and how did you respond to it?
Well, I think I'm following what you're asking. How do I respond? I think the one thing I've tried to say to myself, because it's in the book a bit, but I don't want to make a big issue out of it. But I've had the death threats, I've had all that, and I've had the abuse, and I've had the press hostility, the usual press.
Bodyguard in South Armagh.
Yeah. Yes, quite. So it's all been there, but I said to myself, well, they want you to shut up, so I'm not going to do that. And the only way, the survival, I think for me, has been to do the opposite, and that's make sure that I have a profile that can be seen. So that if anything's going to happen, they're going to have to do it in public. Because I'm not going to hide away somewhere and then I just disappear and nobody's even noticed I was there. So protection for me is public protection. And it happens here, but it happens in London. It happened today, walking back, which I really, it sounds a bit posy, but people come up and they say, they don't always quite get who I am, but they sort of, yeah, no, who are you? And so I stand there, while they work it out. And a couple came up today and they said, and often they just say one or two things. And it's that keeps me going, because I think that's the protection. The fact is, you're recognised at a certain level, not too high, at a sufficient level that there's a form of protection that they recognise and they're just saying thank you. But I had one in Chancery Lane near where I work. She came up and it was half my height, so she was sort of shaking my hand right down here. And she said, I've been wanting to meet you. Yes. I found the easiest thing is just to let them say, because if you start asking questions, fatal. So, and she said, I've got this problem with my drains. Sometimes that's a euphemism for something physical. But it wasn't. It was. She'd explain where she lived and all the rest of it. So I was waiting for the punchline. She said, and the thing is, it's been going on for years. And she said they're blocked, most of them, and it means I can't live there anymore. And and I know. She says that you will be able to solve this problem. I said, well, it's not exactly my area, drains, but I know a man or woman who probably could help you with your drains. She said, oh, she said, I love you. She took my hand and she said, George. I said, don't finish it, I know who you're talking about. I'm afraid George is dead. She goes, oh, and she sort of disappeared. Oh, well, that's it then, I'm not having you, whoever you are. And I thought it was very funny, because sometimes they do mix it up. But it is that is the, if you like, the crucible and the protection at the same time, so you feel, I feel safe. Even when I came here when it wasn't quite so safe, I sort of felt that's the only way to do it.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yep. Go ahead. I'll take you next if you don't mind. I'll get a gentleman first and I'll come to you.
Yeah, the sort of narrative is that you have the law, the front line of the law is the police force, etc., etc. In a sort of world where there's all this evil, which is attacking the populace, and what we know is that front line is institutionally, systemically corrupt. The way in which that is, if you like, the defence against that, the things that impose constraints and limits, is however the very thing, more often than not, that is the front line of enforcing, i.e. the law, the English law indeed, because English jurisprudence is, I think quite rightly so, has had a massive influence internationally, globally, and often indeed the common law approach of English law becomes an effective weapon in terms of imposing a restraint on the state and the corrupt actions of the agents of the state. How is it that, in a sense, something which is there should be protecting the common person always ends up with such corrupt agents of enforcement, which isn't a peculiarly English problem. I mean, take the police force anyway, the guardians of the peace, including the Garda Síochána in the south. I mean, so the corruption there over the last number of years has been phenomenal. But how is it that these great principles and noble things like a body of law, like traditions, legal traditions, which are centuries old, or is it the sort of the agents of enforcement always end up so corrupt?
Power. Always power at the end of the day, because somebody wants to keep it, and they will do it. They'll do almost anything to keep it. So if you're going to have a state, and unless you've got a truly democratic situation in which you have a democratic police force or an agency of the state that is democratically run properly, the risk of corruption within it is huge, because at the end of the day, the source of their remuneration comes from the state. So they're not going to, they're not going to rock the boat if when it comes to it. So I'm not saying every police force or all police officers. I'm just saying the risk of corruption is extremely high. But I think it's not just police forces. The risk of corruption is wherever you have layers of authority and you have people, in positions of power who have visions of, if you like, grandiose promotion of themselves and what they are. They become consumed with themselves. And so it can affect not just police forces, but obviously can affect local authorities, can affect all sorts of authorities where there is a structure which imbues power and doesn't involve. That's why I'm very keen on the Occupy movement and the fact that there was a moment where people realised that they could take over things and run them themselves, which would, once you have a tier of authority, then you have corruption. But if you can organise it so that the people themselves are running it for their own benefit, and they're not having to, as it were, support some superstructure, which then becomes a raison d'etre for itself. So you have to do away with that. So it's very, very difficult, because obviously people think in terms of pyramids and structures, and as you get towards the top of it, they want to stay there. So well, how do they stay there? They want to make sure all their mates are there. Well, that's the problem we got at the moment. Exactly the problem today. May won't go unless she's forced, or there's a night of the long knives, or whatever may happen.
Can I just say just a wee word on that, just in terms of the North? When you look back at the conflict in the North in the last 40 years, the agencies of the criminal justice system, not just the police, I'm talking about the prosecution, we didn't prosecute soldiers, didn't prosecute police officers. You look at the judiciary, which was a very unionist, middle class, upper class, even those not from unionist background or from different class. You look at the, even when we're looking at some of these cases, pathology as well, when you're talking about an inquest or a criminal case, some of those pathologists were in the Territorial Army. For me, that was a conflict of interest when they were carrying out pathology reports on the Ballymurphy, people who lost their lives in Ballymurphy. So the entire criminal justice system was used as a tool to deny the human rights abuse. It wasn't just the police. You look at that whole trail. Now, yeah, I mean, it was a state, and it was a conveyor belt justice. So the whole thing had to work. So you had a corrupt police. It wasn't enough, because a good prosecutor or a good judiciary would have dealt with it, potentially. But if the whole system is working, it's almost becomes a conveyor belt, the whole system is corrupt, you have a big problem. And that's what happened during the conflict. Now, there has been changes. We're far from at the finish line, far from it. And as you said, it isn't just our society coming out of conflict that has those problems. You see it in the United States, you see it in many countries. But in terms of the legal system, we have a judiciary which is in a much better place. I mean, the Ballymurphy families are better placed than me, but certainly, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I would say there's a certain confidence in the process we're involved in now. I mean, there's no doubt about it. There's a participation. I mean, the original inquest, families were treated abysmally. Some of those families, I know that anybody from the Taggart family here, Belle Taggart, was told that she had one less mouth to feed when she had taken a civil election. That's how the judge treated her when he was trying to deal with the case. Soldiers weren't compellable witnesses. They are now. I mean, we have a week, in 2 weeks' time, we have a week set aside for subpoenas for soldiers who are not responding to the process. And that's something that we had to keep the court on top of in the last year or two. So you have a very different system. That has come about. It's not a perfect system, but certainly it's something that you can have confidence in now, and that's very, very important. So even if we still have a police force who are making mistakes, if we have an independent judiciary, if we have lawyers like Michael Mansfield who are prepared to take these cases, prepared to fight them, then you have a chance. And you mentioned earlier on, it's my guiding light in this, I want to give people a fair crack at the whip. And that's what it's all about. When I first met the Ballymurphy families, I couldn't make them any promises. I was very careful not to make any promises. But what I did say is, I believe you can get a fair crack at the whip now. I believe you can get inquests. We'd applied to the local Attorney General at that time. It had transferred from the Advocate General, as he was known, from Britain. And this was a new thing, going to him to get a new inquest. I thought, no, I think we can get a fair crack here. Can't promise. I may get it wrong. And if we do get an inquest, because of the European Convention on Human Rights, because judiciary is moving in a certain way, because of some of the changes, we have a chance. And that's all that I hope to give people. It's a fair crack at the whip. And I think we're seeing the outworkings of that now. Hopefully, because the proof is in the pudding. When we get findings down the road, I know the families can, but there's certainly, we can get things done. And you've seen some of the judicial review challenges in recent times have been very, very positive. I've been involved in 5 legacy inquests which have finished, and each and every one of them, we've had conclusions or findings which have said that force used was unjustified, and that person who died was innocent. I mean, that wasn't doable. It wasn't doable 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, nearly 50 years now since 1972 when the original Ballymurphy inquest. So you have to fight on, and that ground has been made by people like Mansfield that make my job easier. People like Pat Finnegan, Rosemary Nelson, who were lawyers in more difficult times than mine. They paved the way for me. So that's what this is about, you know. So hopefully Michael can inspire younger people now who are coming up. I mean, I have a justice system where they can work effectively, and people in this room could have confidence, because that's very important. It's very important that people have confidence in the justice system, that they believe they get a fair chance at it. So thanks to Michael and people before me have created that pathway for us. So I want to take, there's a lady at the back who had a question, and I'll take a couple more if you want. Yes, yourself?
I flew in from Toronto this morning and rejigged my schedule just to come and hear you gentlemen speak. And I want to say this turnout is a testament to this community on such an evening, such a great volume of people. I'm a member of the Law Union of Ontario. We're a progressive collective of lawyers, legal clinic workers, and paralegals. And I learned today about the McPherson inquiry, and we're currently now in the midst of, with the Ontario Human Rights Commission, looking at the treatment of Black men by the Toronto Police Service. They're 20 times more likely to be lethally shot and killed on stops, more likely to be incarcerated. And so what I'm wondering is, we're 30 years behind the ball where you were in England looking at these issues. We're educating our judiciary about unconscious bias and prejudice. Is there a role for the Commonwealth to, because they have a set of principles and we're all united on the Commonwealth on the basis of colonialism. Is there a role for the Commonwealth for us to lobby each nation so that everybody's looking at everybody's stuff rather than talking about banning straws?
I got a thing for it. I'm looking to get us out of the Commonwealth as quickly as possible. So Michael can answer that question. Your question's actually a very important question.
And nobody knows what's going on in other places, is my point.
You want to take that, Michael?
Well, I think the short answer is no. There isn't. I mean, there's a Commonwealth, as you know, and they meet regularly, and that is a vehicle. But actually, you know, at the end of the day, percolating through that to get people on the ground to approach matters in the way that Macpherson did is a model which can be exported. So I think it, as ever, I don't think it can be left to politicians, and it can't be left to senior lawyers. It's left to people like yourselves. And what interested me about Macpherson at a much lower level was the fact that the Lawrence family met the Bloody Sunday families, who met the Hillsborough families, and they although all different, they began to see that there were lessons in each, seeds to be sown, including, you know, the institutional racism thing. So that they passed it on. And I think it's at that level that things do get changed. It's not at the so-called higher level. It's not there isn't a law that's going to enforce this or facilitate it. I mean, there are, you know, laws about anti-racism and so on and incitement. But at the end of the day, you know, they set agendas, but actually getting things done is down to communities to communicate between themselves, and they always have an understanding because they've all had to struggle, they've all had to put up with negative vibes, but they've fought it. So personally, that's how I think progress is made.
Okay, thanks very much for the question. Any other questions? Maybe take one or two more before we finish off this lady here.
I'm sure you're aware last summer where there was a very high profile trial, the rugby trial, and I'm sure in your breadth of experience you've seen how the media and communication has gone from being maybe 6 o'clock and 1 o'clock in the afternoon and the papers to 24/7 total coverage, and the way that media would have maybe controlled the discourse about certain social justice issues or cases or, you know, things that happen of note. Have you any view on how the rise of social media, like the New York rise of it, has affected public discourse and awareness of injustice? And is it a good or a bad thing? Or do you notice, I know there's positive and negative, but what's your view on
Well, it's like the founder of the web said today, there's extremely bad and extremely good, so obviously there's always two sides to the coin. I am very hostile towards social media. I don't participate, I don't do any of it. I'm amazed by the number of people who do broadcast themselves, basically, without really thinking about it. So, you know, we're conscious of privacy and the need for privacy, but at the very same time, we're all on the mobiles sending out information all the time. So I think people have become very lax about it. I don't want to be a Luddite and say, you know, obviously there are advantages, but the problem we now have is, and that's why I said at the beginning, you can have all sorts of standards, but actually at the end of the day, what horrifies me, completely horrifies me, is the extent to which people, ordinary people, are venomous on social media. And I watched, it was on maybe a BBC Panorama, I can't remember, about a week ago, and I'm very conscious of the bullying issue because my daughter, one of my daughters, committed suicide a few years ago, and we've set up a charity, SOS, to support people. And what I've become conscious doing this, meeting families again, is the extent to which the very problem with the Kelly family is that people are inciting you to take your own life. They're challenging you to do this. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. The kind of things, the communication levels, the way in which it is now thought to be perfectly all right because you can be anonymous, but even if you can't be anonymous, they don't mind. They will say anything, absolutely anything. And the programme I watched a week ago was actually about politicians, and it was actually about Brexit. And the level of animosity and hatred and bile that is being put out to ordinary politicians, and it's Sowerby, the Tory who's gone off to the Independent Party. I mean, I have no sympathy for her politics, but I have absolute sympathy. What she has to put up with on a daily basis, and she brought along her phone. And even while she was on the programme, the stuff that's coming through is so despicable. You kind of feel something's got to be done about this. And in a way, it goes back to, you know, guys running onto the pitch at a weekend. I don't want to sound like Mary Whitehouse, but I do feel it is necessary to understand this isn't about putting more police on the streets or having more stewards at football matches. It's about an attitude of mind. It is about a culture that we seem to have lost the ability, you know, the word that used to be bandied about respecting each other. And even if you disagree, and that, you know, that was the whole thing about the anti-racist and provocation legislation, incitement to racism, where people say, oh, you know, this is doing away with freedom of speech. I'm sorry, freedom of speech is not a license, basically, to kill. And I feel that, I'm sorry, I've sort of exaggerated it a bit, but I'm strongly opposed to the way social media has been used, and I think the platforms that are facilitating this really do have a responsibility to ensure, if the individual can't ensure that they are respectful to each other, that you don't allow the information highway to become toxic, because I think that's what it is. And that's why I don't do it. I'm not interested. You know, I don't have a tweet, and I don't do that. I don't have Instagrams, I don't have a Facebook, so I don't have to worry. And what this politician's worry was, she makes a speech, and she looks immediately on Facebook, see how it's received. Ridiculous. Don't do it. If you're out in public, don't constantly see how you're reflected. The problem is everybody's too worried about their images and how they're reflected. On that note, I'll say good night.